Welcome to the Coming Home Well podcast, the show that educates, supports, and advocates for the veteran community. Your host, Dr. Tyler Pieron, U.S. Army retired, will bring you exciting conversations with amazing guests about resources, research, and military history, all geared to helping our warriors to come home well. Here's your host, Dr. Tyler Pieron.
Welcome back to Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Tyler Pieron, and we are doing something to celebrate the holidays. And to help me do that, I have John Hughes Wilson, retired British Army, and you may remember him. He was on just recently talking about his book on military blunders, and we are going to be talking about something that, well, it's kind of heartwarming, as heartwarming as war can be. So back in the early 1900s, we've had two great wars, World War II, which we all have seen a million books, but there was a preceding war, the World War I. They called it the Great War at the time. They thought it was the war to end all wars. Of course, not too many years later, we had World War II. But back in World War I, there was an event that occurred that was recorded, and people talk about it today. And it's something that I don't know that we'll ever see again, just because of the nature of warfare. But it was on Christmas Day. John, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well.
Tyler, it's my pleasure.
So what happened in 1914 that should bring us a little Christmas cheer?
Well, it should bring a bit of Christmas cheer because it shows the humanity of the soldier. And soldiers, we often forget this, particularly civilians, are human beings. They are normal people like you, like me, pretty well, and they have the normal problems, emotions, difficulties. And if you're living on the battlefield, life, as I'm sure you know, is harsh and rough and cold and miserable and wet. And though you can get through it because it's part of what being a soldier is, you welcome a break from the drama, the death, the trauma. And that's really what this event of Christmas 1914 commemorates.
So what exactly happened?
Well, basically, the British and the Germans, particularly, but not just the British and the Germans, downed tools and took a holiday on Christmas Day.
So like they're in the middle of the trenches, kind of like the Russians and the Ukrainians are right now in trench warfare. Christmas Day comes along and they're like, oh, we're going to take a break and just, meet with the enemy and have a little Christmas party?
Well, kind of, you got it in one. But before we go down that road, we have to look at the history, and this will interest, because I think a lot of your audience are ex-military.
Oh, yeah.
You need to look at the history of fraternization. And fraternization in war is much more common than the military history books will tell us, or the newspapers want us to report, and the politicians certainly don't want to talk about it. But fraternization between enemies has been going on ever since the men have been beating the hell out of each other. And I give you a couple of very quick examples. When Wellington was fighting in Spain, 1810 to 1814, the British soldiers, Scots, Irish, Welsh, whatever, English, they actually openly fraternized at certain times of the year with their French counterparts. And they did what happened in the American Civil War as well, big time. They went down there to exchange goodies and have a chat and have a hot drink and not be shooting each other. And usually the fault line was by a river. Now, if we go to the American Civil War, where there's been quite a lot of work done by pretty smart academics on the whole business of fraternization, we find that in the American Civil War, it's much more common for Johnny Reb and Yank to meet up and get together. And I suppose the biggest one I would quote is, and I apologize if my pronunciation is not right, I don't speak Native American. I think it's called the Rappahannock River.
Close
Uh,
enough.
what?
Close enough.
Close enough. Thank you. Anyway, one at the Christmas, I think in 1863, they went down to the river, which was frozen back in those days, and they exchanged stuff. And both sides were snowed in. The food wasn't getting up because at that stage of the Civil War, logistics were rubbish. And they were hungry, cold, wet, tired, all the things you don't want to be as an infantryman. I know because I've been there. And suddenly, Johnny Reb was saying to the Yank, "Hey, you guys want some cigars?" And they traded cigars for coffee across the river. And that actually became quite a big trade. Food, fruit, and they actually fraternized. And there's a very famous painting, I think, in one of the American museums of soldiers fraternizing, which is a fine painting. And there are also a number of academic books from first research, primary research on the subject, which are very good. So fraternization really has been around a long time. Now, if we fast forward to Christmas 1914, what happens there? Well, basically, the Germans thought at the start of the First World War, we'll have the Schlieffen Plan, we'll sweep through Belgium, we'll come round behind Paris and we'll take it over. Well, the Schlieffen Plan, although the Germans are very good staff officers, I know because I've had German officers work for me, for some reason the great German general staff got it wrong. They didn't do their sums. A German not doing his sums properly? Astonishing, but true. They hadn't worked out that by Christmas 1914, the horses would have run out of fodder because it's a horse-drawn war still, 1914. The horses run out of fodder and it all collapses on the Marne. The Germans pull back. Someone digs in on the trench. Someone else digs in, and suddenly you have a line of trenches from the English Channel, or if you want it in French, La Manche, down to Switzerland. 450 miles of trench, no flanks.
Wow.
The men are dug in. In some places, they're 50 yards apart, some places closer. And so there's the other factor comes in. No one's going to move anywhere.
Right.
It's a static wall, and you're in close proximity to Harry Hun or to the kilted Scotsman. What happens? Live and let live is the French. The French have a phrase which translates as live and let live. That becomes almost automatic the minute the trenches go in. And we see that as early as November and December 1914. And what happens there, Tyler, is very simple. You're having your breakfast as Harry Hun in the trench across there, and I'm having my breakfast here, trying to cook up a bit of bacon on a smoking fire. It is piddling down with rain. No one's happy. We don't waste time shooting each other. We just want our breakfast. And so you get
I'm picturing this.
informal breaks.
Yeah. I'm picturing this just like sitting in there in the mud in the trenches, which is miserable existence. And
Yes,
they don't have these modern conveniences like we have now and incredible logistics. You've got to cook up your own food, and 50 yards is very close. You could probably shout out at each other.
they
And
do.
yeah, and you pop up. I've seen enough movies. If you pop up, you might get shot, that kind of thing. They're
Yes.
just looking and very static. And so it's Christmas morning.
Well, it all starts on Christmas Eve, where the Germans, who at the time were very strong on Christmas,
Hmm.
because anyone who's been in Germany will know that uh, Weihnacht is important to them, Christmas. And the Germans across from the British start putting up little fir trees,
Hmm.
little Christmas trees on their parapet and start singing Heilige Nacht. And the Brits can hear them, and no one's going to start shooting in that situation. So the British start shouting and singing back. Come Christmas morning, no one's going to put the rifle up, and some brave soul, we think we can identify the first person to do it. He comes out of the 18th Brigade up near Messines, and that's a brave man. He sticks his head over the parapet, looks around, nothing. He can see Germans on their trenches walking up and down. So he gets out, walks across, and shakes hands with the German. And that is recorded. We know that happened.
Hmm.
And then eventually, almost spontaneously, Tyler, people get out of their trenches and start mixing. And then you get this extraordinary business where, for the rest of the day, British officers go up to German officers, they shake them by the hand. Someone produces a bottle of brandy, as you do. We share brandy, we have a drink, we chat. At one point, the parson appears and says, I'd very much like to bury the dead who've been lying out here. And both sides say, sure. And so you get the extraordinary phenomenon of priests on both sides having a joint service in several places while the soldiers are buried, the dead. You also
Wow.
get that some of it is, well, there's no doubt alleged, it's true. Some of the British soldiers take a football, a soccer ball, and they start kicking it around between the trenches, and the Germans join in. Now, whether this is an organized game or a spontaneous one, we've never been able to discover.
Hmm.
But there's no doubt they share drinks, they exchange cap badges, they swap rations. What's this black bread? What's this muck? It's black bread. Nein, my friend, das ist Pumpernickel. Very good. You see?
Oh yeah,
And
The
this,
Germans have every type of bread. It's amazing.
yes, it is. But to the Brits, pumpernickel black bread, I'm not eating that muck. No, I'm not going to eat it under any circumstances. And the fraternization goes on all day. The high command gets a whisper of trouble later in the day. The chaps aren't fighting, they're out of their trenches and they're shaking hands with the Germans. What?
Hmm.
Good heavens above, you can't have that sort of thing. And on the front line, they actually agree we will not shoot until midnight. And in some places, some of the units say we will not shoot at all until, and of course, 2 or 3 days, soldiers get killed, there's a bit of artillery, the war starts again. But the Christmas truce happened, and it was an extraordinary event. It's been calculated, Tyler, 100,000 men
Wow.
were involved on both sides. A
I was
hundred.
picturing this was just like a, a battalion sized,
No,
maybe.
no, no.
Yeah, I was, just
This is
picturing.
the this is down the front, and if you start to look at the French, and I might have to check my notes here. Yep, the French have a down tools down in the Vosges Mountains, where the trenches are at some point only 10 yards apart,
Wow.
because the gap is filled with barbed wire,
Mm-hmm.
and they're throwing bottles of wine from the French to the Germans, who are throwing bottles of brandy back. And the French, basically, in the Vosges Mountains down in the south, they have a truce that lasts until the new year.
Oh, wow.
Wow. So this is a general problem across the front. Now, the question you're going to ask is, what happened next year? Well, after next year, the Lusitania had been sunk, poison gas had been used,
Mm-hmm.
the casualty figures on both sides were astronomical, and any goodwill had evaporated,
Mm. Yeah.
gone.
The
So it never really happens again. But on the Eastern Front, because remember, this is a European civil war,
mm-hmm.
which is how I always think of the Great War, the Russians, who are fighting against the Austro-Hungarians, the Habsburgs, they actually have truces on and off throughout the war.
Hmm. Do you think that's because they fought at units, much more regimented versus individual soldiers and smaller unit tactics that we see in modern war? They would have much larger pushes. Individual soldiers weren't supposed to take the initiative. Whereas now, especially now, very much so, a squad or a platoon or a company will go and do something and control some sector and will take the initiative whenever they can. Whereas there, it was always a much larger concerted effort to go and they weren't professional soldiers necessarily. Maybe the Prussians and the Germans, they tend to have a little more mercenaries. And I remember all the times I would read about the Hessian mercenaries. Even in our own revolution, we had German mercenaries involved in the fighting. Do you think that
Well,
might be part of the reason they would have a truce is because it was more the individuals that weren't really professional soldiers. They had been drafted in and were regular people for the most part, or do you think it was just the humanity part?
that's a very interesting question and breaks down into several answers. First of all, both the armies that go to war in 1914 on the Western Front are pretty professional.
Hmm.
The Germans have a 2 year conscription. So at the end of 2 years, by the standards of the time, they've got a pretty good professional infantry soldier.
Hmm.
The British Army was totally professional, all
Mm.
volunteers, and by Christmas 1914, it had taken 80% casualties.
Oh, wow.
So there's only about 20 or 30,000 left of the first 100,000 that go there as the volunteer army. So the answer is the professionalism is there at the start of the war. It evaporates as more and more conscription comes in later.
Hmm.
And conscription only comes in Britain at the end of 1916.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that.
Until the end of 1916, the British fight the First World War with all volunteers, which is astonishing.
Yeah, especially
Now,
given those casualty rates.
oh, terrible, extraordinary. Now, what is particularly interesting about that is, and it's embedded in your question, the soldier, I think, is the catalyst, the individual for the fraternization.
Mm-hmm.
It's the individual soldier, just like in the American Civil War, making friends across the river, swapping stuff. That's the catalyst. And commanders, clever commanders, thinking commanders, would sometimes realize this is, we need a bit of a break. You can't be fighting balls out, to use an expression, all the time.
Yes. And that gets it's an interesting conundrum where if you are in the fight, even in modern combat, it's not as often where people are in the fight, even if they're in a deployed environment every day, like it was back then, or Vietnam, that kind of thing. And now you'll see it with different rotation schedules. Like our U.S. Marines, they'll go and rotate for 3 or 4 months, sometimes 6 months, but a much shorter period of time for a
Mm.
combat tour, whereas the Army, it'll be 12 or 15 months. But that's usually
Well,
more the logistics folks and the people that are providing the backbone, whereas the infantry forces, the U.S. Army will send them out for months and months, but depends on the amount of contact that they're in. But yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration, especially with PTSD and all these other things that are going on because of this intense contact for so long. But yeah, that it is amazing. I'm sure the high command was not pleased to find the entire line is playing soccer, exchanging wine and brandy, and meeting with the enemy without taking action. Did anybody get in
well, that's,
trouble?
oh, where do you get these questions from? That's a very shrewd question. That's a very good one. Um, I'm going to flick through the notes here because I've gone to read a quotation to you. That's actually a true one. I've got to just find it a second. Yes. Yes. The the Guards, the 2nd Battalion, the Scots Guards, an elite regiment. And remember in 1914, if a private soldier, a guardsman, wanted to talk to an officer, he had to put his feet in, find the corporal, and ask for permission to speak to the officer.
Hmm.
I mean, the British Army and the Guards in 1914, the discipline was ferocious by our
Mm-hmm.
standards. Um, they were not impressed in the Guards. And one of the Guards officers, I think, was court-martialed
Oh
for it. And
wow.
this is the one I'm looking for. But it gets better. He gets off.
Ah.
Now, why does he get off? That's what I'm looking for.
I always find it fascinating to find the differences and sort of the analogies. You know, most uh, Western armies have uh, the concept of the officer enlisted NCO corps and some warrants and just how it's applied, but also it comes back to these many times the British uh, developed ways of doing things and then permutations thereof. And
Yes.
especially in our Navy, it's amazing to see the differences as a Army guy. When I would go to the Navy, and we were at a dining facility, and I was doing a tour of some submarines, and it was very nice. And we were at the dining facility, and my group of Army officers were sitting there, we're eating, and when we're done, we're all looking to what to do with our trays, like to clean up ourselves. And we were told, oh, you just leave them and they'll be taken care of. And we're all like looking around, going, that's so alien to our experience. But they had folks that would come along and clean up and take care of everything, like a waiter and cleanup crew, a busser, as we call them. And it was so alien to our experience to be eating in a separate area, a separate officer-only dining area, and then have someone just take care of all that for you. And I was like, this is crazy because in the army we don't do that. Everyone eats at the same place. You clean up your own mess. It was just a cognizant difference of discipline, I guess, of how things are done.
Well, every nation is different,
Oh yeah.
and every service within a nation is different. And for example, one of the problems, if you look at the diaries of people like General Mark Clark,
Mm-hmm.
he comments at length, and he actually writes papers on the difference between the British forces under his command in Italy and the American forces. And he realized the British would put a battalion in to do an attack, say a battalion attack.
Mm-hmm.
The battalion would take casualties. It would be withdrawn from the line, a new battalion put in, and the attacking battalion would be sent back into divisional reserve to make up the casualties, rest and recuperate, and then go back again. In the American Army of 44, 45, if you're a grunt, and you can see it in the cartoons in the Stars and Stripes newspaper at the time,
Mm-hmm.
you have these wonderful bearded characters living in foxholes who've been there since D-Day.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the other stand of the Reichswald Forest. They've been constantly in action on active service for 5 months, six
Mm-hmm.
months. Now, every soldier is going to get worn down by that. And I think that was a mistake by the American management of their people. You have to rotate them. Even the Germans on the Eastern Front in the Second War rotate their people. Although I must say, there wasn't a lot of fraternization in World War II between the Red Army, the Soviets, and the Wehrmacht, but that's a separate matter. But the way you handle soldiers, is different. For example, in the British Army, officers they fight and live and go in the mud with the soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
live in the trenches, from lieutenant colonel downwards. You're a grunt, one way or the other. Out of the line, officers are separated.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not because officers are wonderful people who've got to have their bottoms wiped and be looked after and nice. It's not for that reason. It's to give the soldiers freedom from the officers.
Mm. That's
Because
an
the
interesting
last
approach.
thing a soldier wants is someone breathing down his neck 24 hours a day. He wants to go to the naffy or the canteen, have his can of beer or whatever he's allowed to have, and say, that bloody officer's useless.
Mm-hmm.
So
Let off
everyone
that
needs their,
steam and
you need your space.
absolutely.
Now,
So
going
it,
back,
yeah, to 1914, I'm picturing this scene with all these people just, impromptu soccer game happening, exchanging things off their uniforms and tchotchkes and things like that. I'm sure there were officers on the line. I'm sure there were some lieutenants and captains, and
oh
they
yes.
must have been losing their mind or just sort of going, "What's happening?" And then too late, they're already there and decide, well, all right, we're going to do this. Do you think it's because they
Well,
shared a faith?
no, that's again another. I don't know what knife box you've been sleeping in, but you've got some sharp questions. What's universal is among the soldiers and the officers on the British side is surprise
Mm-hmm.
that this is happening, and then acceptance that this is happening. And it's quite clear for most of the officers involved, they were as grateful as the soldiers for a period of respite, but not everyone was. And
Mm-hmm.
you may have heard of a chap called Charles de Gaulle.
Mm-hmm. Very
Now,
famous.
a very famous French president. Uh, as Churchill said, he was the cross that Churchill had to bear during the Second World War. But in 1914, he was a lieutenant in the French army, professional soldier. And he wrote on the 7th of December, 1914, just translating the French very quickly, the lamentable desire of the French soldier to leave his enemy in peace, which was bad for morale and was not proper behavior of a French soldier. So embedded in there, you've got the fire eaters who think this is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but they're an absolute minority.
I wonder, and this isn't really a question for you, but it's more of a comment. With modern communications and other things, we tend to create a bogeyman of our enemy,
Yes,
and try to reduce their humanity as much as possible. But that's often through various media, newspapers, you
yes,
name it. I wonder how much that wasn't in place in the early part of World War One,
no,
and
not at all.
shared religion. It's a civil war essentially. They know these people. They've traded with these people. It's not like they are some foreign enemy that they don't understand their ways. And so when you see the Christmas songs and the pine trees going up and the little, to celebrate Christmas, they recognize, well, I celebrate Christmas. Let's have the Christmas spirit, and that sort of contributed to the
Yes,
armistice.
I think that's a very perceptive remark, if I may say so. I think a very perceptive remark because you've got to remember also, taking that thought on, Tyler, the British and the Germans are much more closely related than we tend to remind ourselves because the correct name of the royal house of Windsor, now called Windsor, is actually Saxe Coburg Gotha.
Mm-hmm.
Queen Victoria is half German. Most of the British dukes and royal aristocracy are Hanoverians
Mm-hmm.
and Germans. So the links at the highest level are very close. I mean, the Kaiser was a field marshal in the British Army and an admiral in the British fleet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, honorary positions, but it shows how interwoven the royal houses were. And that, of course, goes into society as well.
All these cousins fighting. It's always amazing to me if you look at the history and if you look at the relations. Many of the leaders, especially World War One era, were all cousins and relatives of one thing or another, and it was just amazing that they would all be fighting all the time just because of that. These you'd think that they would have it locked down and be able to handle it in other ways, but no, there was incredible fighting and
Well,
incredible death and destruction.
the Pope and the Americans, particularly, made a huge effort. President Wilson actually sends a presidential envoy in late 1916 to say, look, stop this madness, because the casualties of the First World War are terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Stop this madness. And by then, there's so much bad blood between the sides that was impossible.
Right.
But if that initiative had been made in Christmas 1914, it might have had a greater chance of success.
So I'm going to throw you a curveball. Do you know of any other times where something is similar as to the the peace that broke out on Christmas Day in 1914? Any other similar events? You talked a little bit about, the fraternization, but anything as large scale or widespread and sort of happenstance, or is this a one-time thing?
I think in terms of modern warfare,
Hmm.
it's a one-off. Uh,
Which makes it all the more fascinating.
but it really is the end of a period of history where fraternization was perfectly normal,
Hmm.
particularly in civil wars. And in the English Civil War in the 1640s, where the Brits solved their problem by cutting the king's head off, a modest solution to the problem.
A
They
permanent one,
actually,
though.
yeah, but it works. It works. But the Civil War in England, there's endless fraternization, brother and brother. And you see the same in the American Civil War.
Hmm.
Uh, the only thing, the risk of upsetting America or someone in the audience, the only thing that did not come out of the American Civil War was the reluctance of particularly the Confederates to treat their black soldiers as equal with white soldiers.
Hmm.
But that's a product of the time and the whole
Oh, yeah.
American environment at the time. But by and large, take away the black soldier thing, you could say that the American Civil War was fraternization was normal.
Right.
By 1914, that fraternization was ended. This is the last mass fraternization I
Hmm.
know. And I'll be honest with you, Tyler, I can't see, having talked to a lot of my American friends in my career, I can't see an American Marine Corps captain hunkering down at Tet and sharing a beer with the Viet Cong.
Yeah. No.
I can't see a British SAS patrol in Afghanistan sitting halfway up a rock and having to wipe his backside with a stone, which, of course, you know what it's like in Afghanistan. He was not going to sit down with a jolly member of the Taliban and say, let's have Christmas off, old chap. It is
Yes.
not going to happen. So
No.
the world has become, and here's an idea, in some ways a worse place.
Hmm.
Common humanity in warfare now is gone.
No, very much so, and it's much more lethal, much more uh, fast-paced, and definitely a different time and a different place. But it was, I guess, a Christmas miracle. It was covered in the newspapers of the time, and
It
uh,
was. It was. In fact, it took until the 1st of January for the news to break in UK. The French suppressed it. The
mhm,
French censorship suppressed it completely. But the soldiers, because the trenches were so close to London,
mhm,
the British had an incredible postal service. A lot of the soldiers in the trenches were getting a parcel from their mum or dad
mhm,
within 48 hours with a pair of woolly socks that
mhm.
mom had knitted for them
Oh, wow.
and and coffee essence and goodies, a tuck parcel. Um, they were getting that, and the soldiers are writing back, provided there was nothing military in them,
Hmm.
because the every soldier's letter was censored by an officer, which the officers hated doing. Uh, those letters eventually are back in there by the first week in January. The press splash it and put out some photographs. And I've got a couple of photographs which I will share with you, and you can intersperse in your edited version, uh, showing how the press reacted to this. And it becomes public knowledge. And people actually say, oh, good, maybe this is the end of the war.
Ah, yeah, that would be the hope, wouldn't it?
And of course, it doesn't happen.
And it goes even worse, and much more violence follows. But peace is always the hope of any war. Any soldier prizes peace over anything. We understand how horrific war is. And so I think that people, especially if they've been doing this a while, in London and would have been in France that they heard, would have been a Christmas miracle. And hopefully, but no, it was not a portent of things to happen. Well, John, thank you so much for sharing with us the Christmas miracle of 1914, the armistice, the peace breaks out, and the joy that was shared between the troops, up and down the line, 450 miles of fortifications. It reminds me so much of what's really happening right now today as we come up towards Christmas with the Russians and the Ukrainians. I doubt there will be a Christmas break, but one can hope that there will have some peace on these ditch lines that they're fighting, this trench warfare that's ongoing currently in the eastern part of Ukraine and northern part of Ukraine with the Russians and the Ukrainians. But one can hope that there is another peace breaking out, and there is at least a day of refuge. John, again, thank you so much for coming on Coming Home Well and sharing with us the really quite remarkable story of a Christmas story of 1914 and peace breaking out, at least for a day.
At least for a day. And one can only hope, and I'm sure it will happen, Tyler, on the Ukrainian front, some little Ukrainian or some little Russian is going to say, blow this for a game of soldiers, have some vodka, have some slivovitz.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be illegal, it'll be trouble, but natural common humanity will assert itself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on Coming Home Well, and we'll see you soon.
Can I wish you, Tyler, personally, and all your viewers, particularly those veterans of foreign wars and my American colleagues out there, wherever they are, a very happy Christmas.
And John, thanks to you and all of our colleagues across the pond. The American and British Army have a long and special history, and it is always amazing to think about how we began and then where we are now. It is the juxtaposition of a revolution and an overthrow of a colony, and then not very much longer, all of a sudden, have become the closest of allies. And so I thank you for all of your service and for all of the other folks that are listening. We have listeners across the globe, and I'm sure some are in England and in other far-flung places where the British Empire still remain. John, thank you, and have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
God bless to you.
Thanks for joining us this week on Coming Home Well with Dr. Tyler Pieron. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. Thanks again. And until all are home and all are well, this is Coming Home Well.